I'm Amelia and I have been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes for just under 2 years. I joined the Together Type 1 programme as a young leader a few months after my diagnosis, so also just under 2 years, I think. No, just under 5, no, I don't anymore. For a while, but not forever. And I'll pass over to Heather.
I'm Heather. I've had diabetes for 4.5 years now, and I have been a young leader for I think about 3 years of that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Heather. And Iona will be joining us at some point. Unfortunately, she's not able to make the webinar for the start, but that's absolutely fine because you will still hear from her when she's able to arrive. So just to quickly run through tonight's agenda. We'll start with an interactive activity just to get everybody going. We'll then come on to Amelia's experience. Another young leader called Lauren, who's written about her experiences for us, and that'll be read out by Amelia. We'll have a parent and newly diagnosed young person's story, which will be read out by Lily. And we will then hopefully have Iona to talk about her experience. Otherwise, one of our other young leaders will cover that for her. And we will then finish with an interactive activity, which will hopefully encompass a lot of what is covered in this session. And finally, I would greatly encourage you to fill out as much of the feedback form as you can before you leave today, just so that we can keep bringing you these webinars and keep tailoring the topics so that they're interesting and relevant for you all. So I'll start now by handing over to Heather.
Okay, so this is our first interactive activity. So we just wanted to ask you if you follow Lily's put the link in the Teams chat, the Zoom chat as well, or you can scan the QR code on your screen. And basically, we just wanted to find out, how do you feel about addressing complications in clinic with your patients? If you have any issues, just pop them into the Zoom chat. We can see them from there as well. So yeah, if you could just do that, we'd be really interested to find out. I think awkward and challenging are kind of the ones that are the most it's quite interesting. The top two are awkward and challenging, and then the next two are important and comfortable, which I think is possibly an interesting balance between how you address that with the patient.
I was also just reading through some of the ones in the chat, which are really interesting and sort of also reflective of that balance in the Slido as well. Of people saying that it's difficult, but it's important. So I feel like, as Heather was saying, it's sort of that balance between the two. I feel like everybody's probably had a chance to answer.
I think there's just one more that's quite interesting, that parents may not want to bring it up, especially around young children. I think is the balance between having the impact as a HCP, but also the parent being the guardian of the child. It's quite an interesting topic. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks both. So yeah, hand over to you, Amelia.
Okay, perfect. So hi, as I said before, I'm Amelia. I'm 21, and as I've just figured out, I have actually been diagnosed for almost 3 years, not 2 years. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the inspiration for this call, and also my own experiences of how complications have been dealt with in clinic. So basically the call was inspired by a conversation that I had a few months ago with a newly diagnosed girl with type 1 diabetes, which had caused a lot, and she was experiencing a lot of stress and fear and kind of worry around eating as a result of the conversations that the HCPs had with her around the topic of complications. We therefore wanted to kind of bring it to a call like this, in the hope that by having a conversation about how it feels from both perspectives, that we might be able to help fewer people feel that way, especially a diagnosis. So from what kind of I have experienced over the years, I personally haven't experienced any complications, but obviously it's still a topic that comes up in clinic. So the way it's been presented to me, I guess, over the years is that complications are completely awful and life destroying. I would say most healthcare professionals that I've kind of interacted with go one of two ways when dealing with it. Either people deal with it in a very matter of fact way, and just talk about the things that could go wrong. And while that does have its advantages of being very kind of, I guess, transparent with what could happen, it can also be scary just to hear a long list of everything that could possibly go wrong if your diabetes control isn't perfect. Or alternatively, I find sometimes the topic is almost avoided or kind of skirted around a little bit, which I think then often leads people with diabetes to go and do their own research online. And if you've ever tried just like Googling diabetes complications, it's not a fun place to be. Obviously, the internet is just full of worst case scenarios, and I think that therefore causes a lot more anxiety and stress. I would say, yeah, the majority for me is the fact that it's not been spoken about as much. Perhaps it was a diagnosis, but I was in DK, I was very ill. I don't remember a lot of my diagnosis or the kind of education that I received in the hospital at that point. However, what really did stick with me and has stuck with me over the last few years is that I need perfect blood sugars in order to avoid complications. And therefore, the kind of implication in my head is that if I do get diagnosed with a complication at some point, that means that I am somehow not good enough at diabetes. Obviously, I kind of understand the importance of good sugar control and why it's so important to maintain like your good health for as long as possible. But actually, as we've said on quite a few of these calls in the past, often it feels like mental health isn't seen as big of a priority as physical health. And being scared into achieving good blood sugars doesn't lead to good mental health, nor does living under the constant pressure of needing to be perfect. So I would say like what would have been helpful to me at diagnosis and now is knowing that there are things that can be done to help you if you do get diagnosed with a complication. It's only really through my like volunteering that I've done with Diabetes UK and Together Type 1 that I've spoken to various other healthcare professionals and other people kind of in the field and learned that there are plenty of things that can be done by the NHS or whoever else to help you if you do get diagnosed. Um, and as we've said on calls like this before, obviously other like healthcare teams might explain this maybe clearer than mine have to me. But in my experience, I've only learned those things through volunteering that I've done. Um, and I would also say that the existence of complications is enough of a motivator for a lot of us without that kind of being repeated and reminded at every appointment. But knowing what can be done to support you with complications offers reassurance, especially to those of us who are very anxious and very perfectionist about our diabetes management. I think it's so important that young people know that complications aren't a reflection of who they are as a person or a diabetic, because diabetes does tend to become so wrapped up in who you are as a person that if complications are made to feel like your fault in any way, it feels like a huge personal failing. Um, and yeah, I just think overall, that complications are scary to everyone, whether it seems like people are taking that seriously or not. And for the majority of us, we do know the risks and we do our best to maintain that good blood sugar control. But I would say, which is kind of my point across most of these calls that we do, is that we also need to be encouraged to kind of give ourselves a bit of grace and not have the added fear of complications kind of put onto us externally. It makes a huge difference to have a supportive team of healthcare professionals around you. And it makes the world of complications seem a lot less scary. I recently got a new consultant in my team who honestly has made the world a difference. Um, I just really feel like he listened to me properly. He spoke to me about diabetes and how that fits in with my personal life rather than making it feel like my life has to fit around diabetes. And, you know, we had this long conversation about how the good blood sugar control is so important so that I feel better in myself and so that I'm more able to do the things that I love. And I do now feel like if complications were to arise at some point, then I would be like supported and not judged, which isn't something that I'd necessarily felt before. Um, so yeah, that's just a little bit kind of my experience. And I am now going to read out Lauren's. So Lauren is another young leader, but she couldn't make the call. Um, so Lauren says, unfortunately, I'm unable to make the call tonight, but I thought my section of this webinar should focus on how important it is to balance talking about health complications to newly diagnosed diabetics with other matters. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in January 2023, and I was in severe DK at that point in time. So I was not particularly compos mentis whilst the diabetes specialist nurses were speaking to me. Whilst I was still in the high dependency unit with cannula drips in each hand, one of the nurses was trying to show me how an insulin pen worked and tried to make me have a turn putting in the insulin vials without my hands free. She warned me that if I did not learn how the insulin worked, I could end up in DKA again or end up with multi-organ failure or severe diabetic retinopathy. It should be noted that my parents were both with me at the time as it was a paediatric unit, however they were both emotionally drained, so were also struggling to take in the information. It was an extremely stressful time that could have been handled with more care. I ended up having no idea how to change insulin cartridges in my pens as it was dealt with in such a rushed way whilst I was still so ill. And as the fear-mongering surrounding the future complications was thrown at me from diagnosis day one, I ended up having panic attacks the first few times my insulin pens ran out, as I thought something bad was going to happen immediately. Personally, I felt that future complications need to be Personally, I feel that future complications need to be addressed early on, especially as neurodiabetics might not realise the degree of severity of their diagnosis. However, they should be discussed once the newly diagnosed patient has been discharged from hospital or has settled down after their diagnosis. Diabetes is a big change in someone's life, and someone can already be feeling grief and all other kinds of negative emotions without having their future being something for them to fear from the beginning. My paediatric team did not properly explain to me what diabetic retinopathy was, and I didn't even know about the annual eye screening and what it was for until I joined Together Type 1 a few months after I was diagnosed. It felt as though my team were just giving me a long list of complications to scare me when I was first diagnosed so that I would keep my diabetes controlled without providing me with any further education on what it all meant. I'm now in the adult clinic, and my new team have spoken to me about future complications in a way that's not to scare me, but as a way to explain why I need to change my ratios, why it might be a good reason to change to a fast acting insulin, etc. To conclude, I feel that when dealing with newly diagnosed diabetics, the talk of future complications need to be less of a priority than ensuring that the patient is emotionally okay. Feeling comfortable being on their own, as well as educating a partner, parent, or carer on what to do in immediate emergencies. Future complications need to be a discussion once everything has initially settled and with the absence of fear-mongering. The language in clinics for adults and children should shift from what will happen if you don't look after yourself to what won't happen if you try to follow your HCP's advice and look after yourself as best you can. Thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, so now we are going to share a story from a parent and a newly diagnosed young person that was shared with us just recently. So me and Amelia are going to take turns in reading this story out. So I'm going to start. So from day one of my daughter's diagnosis, we have found that at times there is a complete lack of understanding from some healthcare professionals on the nature of what they are discussing and how their words can have an impact on a newly diagnosed child. On day one of diagnosis, whilst on the ward, the nurses looking after G actually told us they couldn't remember how to look after someone with diabetes, as it's so intense and challenging. As you can imagine, hearing that from a nurse was hard to hear, and it made me fear what was to come if a professional found it hard. G was already so scared, and being told this really added to the pressure.
A separate incident on the ward occurred when G was feeling extremely anxious and due to this was struggling to eat her meal. A nurse then came, rather than add some reassurance, decided to tell her that she would be extremely ill if she didn't eat what was in front of her. And did we understand how serious this was? This just added to her anxiety. I asked whether she could, on this occasion, have a sugary drink, which I know isn't ideal, but due to the circumstances with her anxiety. And again, we had some negative comment. Due to the above, another parent in the next bay to us actually made a complaint to the nurse in charge about the care we had received. We did have a more positive experience when seeing the diabetes team whilst in hospital, but by then the negative comments had already affected G in a big way.
We came out of hospital after 5 days. The day after, we arrived home and we were back to see the diabetes team for one of 3 appointments. This is where I feel the most damage was done to G, and from this day is when there was a drastic change in G and her anxiety came out in panic attacks, endless crying, and what I feel was almost a depression. So there was myself, my husband, and G seeing one member of the team. It was a general chat about diabetes and levels and what to look for, etc. We were then hit with how now she's diabetic, she is very susceptible to other autoimmune diseases, as now she has one, she is likely to get another. They then talked through the other conditions. Following that, we then had how diabetes can affect your eyesight, your heart, and other organs. It was delivered in such a matter-of-fact way, and I know this is what they do daily, so they are bound to have no emotional attachment. But to sit in front of a 12-year-old child and tell them every bad thing that could possibly happen to them, I just felt it was so wrong. They could see how she was struggling. I just feel there was no need for them to have told her all of those points. They could have sent her out of the room and told just me, or delivered it in a way that wasn't so formal and matter of fact.
It truly made us so fearful for the future. It sent us into a spiral of denial and fear. Having a healthcare professional tell us how serious it was, how they couldn't understand diabetes themselves, to then be sat down and told every negative of what could happen was too much to cope with. If the above hadn't happened or had happened in a different way, I don't feel G would have gotten as low as she did. Talking to G, she too says that hearing that really scared her. It was said too bluntly and directly. She focused solely on what had been said and found herself Googling and scaring herself more. She really felt confused, scared, and anxious. Unfortunately, many children and their families are left feeling scared, anxious, and fearful of the future. And so now we kind of want to discuss how we can change this together.
So we know it's very important to talk about complications, and we know it's important to manage diabetes effectively to avoid future complications. We know young people and their families must be aware and educated on all of those risks, but can we find a way that this can be done when it informs without increasing fear?
It doesn't seem like Iona's here at the moment. So yeah, Amelia, we're going to pick it
I
up.
do have a script. Yeah, just give me one second.
Perfect. No, that's fine. Just before that, and Heather, I don't know if you want to come in here while Amelia looks for the script, but I noticed there was a question in the chat that said sort of how long after diagnosis would you think it's a comfortable time to discuss complications? So welcoming any thoughts from Heather or Amelia around that.
Yeah. I think rather than focusing on a comfortable time to discuss complications, I think it is also very much up to the age of the person that's being diagnosed. So obviously, if you are an adult, and by that I mean probably 21 plus rather than 18 plus, sort of on an adult ward being diagnosed, obviously there is a bit more availability to be more direct and just sitting down. And obviously, still not saying, you have diabetes. Oh, by the way, there's this whole list of complications that can go wrong. Obviously, still having that time to process, digest, probably still whilst they're in hospital. But I think definitely with younger children, and again, I'm similar to Amelia, I don't remember majority of my diagnosis. I was in hospital for a week. I don't remember most of it. I don't even remember if I was told in hospital. I was 14 when I was diagnosed. So I think possibly with that sort of age group between 14 and 21, again, you can speak to them, but anything younger, like, young secondary school, primary school, that should be information that's told to a parent, and that parent can then decide when the appropriate time is to pass on that information. Because being sat, and Amelia is the perfect word, it is grief. It is grief that you're losing your life as it was before, and being told even in the same day, being told there's this whole list of things that can go wrong. It's an information overload, and I think that's possibly when it's sort of more discretion based in terms of age groups and at what point. But just sitting there and saying, and I've spoken to people who have had the same story as that parent. It's just having a 12-year-old being sat in front of a nurse who's just said, yeah, there's all these things that can go wrong. It's just not the right time. And I think that's the sort of thing that is definitely the compassion needs to be there in order to disseminate that information.
I would also say, just add to that a couple of things, and then I found Iona's script. Is I was actually having a conversation with another young leader recently about the fact that, like, kind of when I both said we can't really remember our diagnosis time, and can't remember what was told to us at that point, is that also often if you are told those things around that point, you remember the fear, but you don't remember the information. And that actually makes it significantly worse because you just know that you're scared, but you don't fully remember why. I think from my own perspective of when would kind of be appropriate, I was diagnosed at 18, so I was in an adult ward, but I mean, I was just 18. It wasn't like I was a proper adult as such. I think it is important to mention maybe to begin with, but not for that proper conversation around complications to happen. I would say, yeah, until blood sugars are a bit more stable, the patient feels a bit more kind of mentally able to take on that information. I think for me, if I'd gone back into the hospital maybe 3-4 weeks after my diagnosis, I would have felt a bit more had a bit more capacity to take on that information without it feeling quite so overwhelming. And I think I just saw in a comment in the chat pop up kind of to gradually introduce the idea of complications and stuff like that, which I think is a really good point. I will share Iona's script as well if that works now. Cool. Hi, my name is Iona, and I've had type 1 diabetes for almost 11 years. In this time, I haven't always had the smoothest journey. I've battled my body and my brain, sometimes both at the same time. When the idea for this webinar first came about, I knew I had to join in. I think it's so important that healthcare professionals know the impact they have on young people, especially when it comes to talking about diabetes complications. At 17, I started to struggle quite badly with my body image, and this quickly escalated into type 1 disordered eating. I continued down this path for quite a few years, but it wasn't until I was 21 that it really took a hold of me. I found that when I first started struggling, healthcare professionals weren't exactly supportive in the way they spoke to me about what I was doing to my body. They utilised complications as a scare tactic, telling me I would lose my feet or go blind. As a 13-year-old, this seemed so far away that it didn't bother me. If anything, it made me feel like I didn't deserve to get better because they made me feel like it was my fault anyway. However, fast forward to a couple of years ago, I changed consultants, and I cannot thank my current consultant enough. He supported me through Tide, making sure I knew that nothing was my fault, and instead spoke about complications in a way that motivated me, not scaring me into controlling my blood sugars, but instead sharing the research behind complications and how I still had a chance to turn things around. Unfortunately, we believe that many of the health complications I'm experiencing now, such as deterioration in my eyesight, autonomic neuropathy, and gastroparesis, are in fact down to my type 1 diabetes. However, at no point have my diabetes healthcare professionals told me it was my fault. Instead, their focus is on what we can do to work with my health complications and continuing to improve my relationship with myself and my diabetes. Overall, I don't believe there's enough meaningful conversation about complications with young people. I think if there was more education on what can happen to us, we would feel like we can reach out to our professionals about our concerns and have people with the information we need around us should complications arise.
Brilliant. Thank you for reading that out, Amelia. So we're coming on to the next Excalidraw activity now. So again, there's a QR code that will take you to that section, and you'll be able to give your opinion now. So I'll hand over to Heather to organise that part.
Yeah, so Excalidraw is a little bit more temperamental, shall we say, than the Slido at the start. So again, if you have any issues, pop it in the chat so we can see it. So the first question is, complications the best term to describe them? Could we choose something else? And if so, what? So any ideas in terms of whether it's a different name or a different way to explain how they can affect a patient? Anything like that, put them on the board. That would be great. I think side effects is an interesting one. We're all kind of aware of anytime, you even take an antihistamine, got a bit of a sniffle, there's that kind of element of just checking, oh, can I drive after taking this? Having that, you're just so used to checking dosages, things like that. I think that would be an interesting one in terms of just sort of saying, yeah, there's these sort of side effects, it kind of calms it down a little bit. That's quite interesting.
I was going to say as well, I would add my own on the Excalidraw, but it's not working on my phone. But one I heard recently as well was someone refer to it as diabetes co-occurring conditions, which I thought was really interesting. With the kind of implication that it sort of goes alongside diabetes, but it's not necessarily sort of a negative consequence in the same way. I don't know whether I prefer it or not. I thought it was interesting.
I think this is one of those conversations that I've always had an issue with the different names that diabetes is called, condition, illness, autoimmune disease, all sorts of things. And I've always been very adamant that I'm not ill. In my head, illness is a cold. I'm not ill. I have a condition that affects my life, like it's like you have a condition of a contract, but I'm not ill. I just have this thing and I get on with it. I think it's that sort of similar to with the complications is that it's yeah, there's things that might happen, but also they might not happen. Not every patient gets every complication. Some people are unfortunately not as lucky as others, but it isn't a 100% this is going to happen, this will affect your life. So I think that's also an interesting kind of topic to sort of how we explain that to patients.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well, because I do think complication in itself has quite a negativity. If you do get those other conditions, those other problems, they are going to cause complications within your life. But yeah, there's definitely a much more negative than maybe some of the others that are being suggested in the chat at the minute, to do with just like health impacts or long-term health. It's kind of interesting, the different conditions of what we call it.
I think promoting long-term health is interesting in terms of putting a positive spin on it, and like, you're doing this to help yourself in the future. You're not doing this to prevent yourself getting other conditions in the future. I think that's quite an interesting spin to put on it. Yeah, I'm not quite sure Excalidraw is being everyone's friend today.
Yeah, I can't use a Excalidraw either. But if anyone does have anything to say, as been mentioned, just pop it in the chat, or if you feel like, putting your hand up and then taking yourself off mute and saying it that way, if it's easier, then please feel free to do that as well. But yeah, no, a number of people are struggling with Excalidraw.
I think that's an interesting comment. Is the negativity based on how it's presented in terms of complications in what it is? It is just a word, but it's the way it's brought up by healthcare professionals, family members, your grandma's cat's friend's dog's brother-in-law that also has diabetes, which I get a lot. That kind of thing. Oh, he had his leg chopped off, and that is genuinely something, might have hyperbole a bit, but that is genuinely a comment I've had, that sort of thing. It's kind of how that's presented rather than the actual word itself. Yeah.
I think it would be really interesting, actually, that if, obviously this isn't likely to happen, but if we were to kind of change the language around it, whether it would still have such a negative kind of connotation and stuff. I quite like the one that's just come through as well, to do like potential challenges later in life. I think that really highlights the fact, like Heather was saying before, that like it could happen, but it might not. And I think, as well as we've kind of touched on through the call so far, obviously it's kind of hard to incorporate in a sort of succinct way of explaining complications, but the fact that negative, like that bad blood sugar control doesn't automatically lead someone to getting like all the complications. Equally, having perfect blood sugar control doesn't mean that you will inevitably like avoid all complications. But I think just throwing the words in like potential actually really makes a difference.
We talk so much about language used in clinic and how language affects patients, and I've just seen an article pop up, and lots of different opinions, but we talk so much about language used with patients and that sort of thing, that it is definitely that, in terms of, obviously we are aware that as healthcare professionals, you are all people as well, and it is so easy to just maybe not say the wrong thing, but even just the tone, or obviously you guys all have personal lives as well. You might come in and just have had a bit of a bad day. We are all aware that you have that, but I think words can have such a big impact, and even body language, or the setting that you're spoken to about. I was diagnosed by a consultant in a corridor of a hospital. Like, it was public, there was other people sat there, and I genuinely thought it was a mistake. Like, it's such a situational, not just situational, but language, body language, everything matters in terms of, it's such a big impact on a person. Oh, the issue of pregnancy. That's an interesting one, because as I said, I was 14 when I was diagnosed. I think the first time I was told about issues around pregnancy and miscarriage and patients with diabetes, I was 15. and I was basically told, you absolutely can't get pregnant without pre-planning, which obviously it's a major thing that it should be pre-planned, but also I was 15 years old. Like I that's way in my future, and I really don't think that was something that needed to be brought up at that point when I was still very scared. But obviously someone that's diagnosed at 25 would have a very different view of that. So I think that's an interesting topic in terms of timeline as well, to how you'd work on that. I don't know if Amelia, if you have a different opinion on that, obviously being another couple of years older than me.
Yeah, I would say my experience is actually very similar to yours, Heather, in that obviously it wasn't really something, I don't think, that was brought up with me kind of immediately, but within probably 6 months or so, they like mentioned it in an appointment. Obviously being that bit older, it just makes sense that they would bring it up fairly soon. I mean, I have to say I'm not sure with anybody that it's really important to bring it up immediately after diagnosis, because I'm not sure that's going through anybody's head straight after they've been diagnosed. I'm not sure anybody is thinking about pregnancy or anything like that. So, yeah, I guess it's so dependent on the age of diagnosis, the kind of stage in life of that person as well. So yeah, it's an interesting point though.
I think just in terms of a realistic explanation of what happened with me with my body is I didn't get my cycle for 4 months after I was diagnosed. That's how much of an impact it had on my body. That was literally my body saying, there is no way on earth you are in a physical condition to have a baby right now. And I think that's possibly quite a nice way of, not nice, really horrible way of putting into perspective how much diabetes diagnosis physically affects you, never mind mentally. It's not just the standard list that you get of you're losing weight, you feel really nauseous, blah blah blah. It's there's other long-term consequences. Like my hair, I had a load of hair falling out. There's other tiny things as well that I think don't get talked about as well.
I think, yeah, actually just building off what Heather was just saying, that obviously the issue of pregnancy and complications potentially surrounding that have to be brought up at some point, but something that wasn't addressed with me, I don't think at any point, similar to Heather, was the fact that, yeah, it affects your hormones and your menstrual cycle so much that mine was messed up for a good year, kind of for 3 months before and then a long time after. I guess partly because of all the weight I'd lost as well as the stress of it and everything else. But I feel like that would be the more immediate thing to be talking about. I have also just seen another question in there about whether we felt that we had enough psychological support with diabetes. I mean, for me personally, I would say no. I've had individual nurses and consultants who've been lovely and very kind of supportive and have let me talk about things if I've needed to. But I would say, at least within the clinic that I go to, there isn't that kind of psychological support available. I've never kind of been offered the chance to properly talk to people about how I've coped with it. I don't necessarily feel like people have asked with that much kind of interest. Often it does just feel a bit like a ticking the box exercise when I'm asked how I am. I know people's experiences on this differ massively from like clinic to clinic. And when we did a previous call on this, it was very different for different people. I don't know whether Heather has different experiences.
Yeah, so obviously Amelia was diagnosed in an adults department. I was, I'm not going to say lucky because let's be honest, no one's lucky with diabetes, but I had I was very grateful for the ability to be able to speak to a psychologist. So I was under my pediatric psychology team for just under 2 years. So I was discharged after I turned 18. One of the things I'm very passionate about is the fact that everything as soon as you turn 18 switches off. My dietetic support, psychological support, anything like that, literally apart from my consultant, my nurse, everything is gone. And I think for such a massive time in your life in terms of I went to uni straight away. I turned 18 at the end of July, and I went to uni in September. To have that kind of ripped away felt a little bit like a stab in the heart. I'd been under an absolutely incredible team. I had 2 different psychologists and a support worker at different points in that. And they were absolutely incredible in terms of just giving me a space to sit down and literally just I'd have sessions where she barely got to speak. I'd literally just go in there and I'd just like rant for an hour, because I think sometimes it's what I found was it was a lot of anger. I didn't realize how much built up resentment I had, against my diabetes, but also like life, for saying why has this happened? Why me? Why is this something that I have to deal with? And looking back now, I've had so many opportunities, and in a way I take it as I'm very much, as soon as I diagnosed, I was like, right, find the silver lining. Try and do as much as you can. Use this to your best ability. If I guess take every opportunity you can. But I was so lucky to have that support and be able to get through that time. But to then have that taken away as soon as I turned 18, was very much that's definitely something that could be improved. But I did just see somebody say, about almost mimicking the language used by the individual. I think that will possibly be quite interesting, because for me, I'm a very scientific person. Both my family is also very scientific too. So to sit us down and say, give us the information, give us the evidence, let us go away and take that in ourselves, we'd be fine with that. But I'm aware of patients, my friends, that wouldn't be the right way to approach that with them, because they just immediately shut off, and they just literally sit in that meeting and go, turn my brain off, not listening anymore, because I don't understand it. And I think, see, you guys are incredibly educated people to be specialized in diabetes. It's an incredibly difficult condition to work with and understand, but to have that ability to be compassionate, but also understand that a lot of people aren't that science driven and focused, and that isn't the way to approach the concept with them, I think is quite an important topic.
I would also say, kind of off the back of that, yeah, sort of the difference between being diagnosed and having these complications and everything explained to you as a child or a teenager compared to as an adult. Not only is that obviously fitting into your life in a different way and your experiences, but also actually having people with you at appointments. Obviously, once you are 18, if you've moved out of home and you're not like with your parents anymore or whatever, chances are you're going to a lot of these appointments by yourself. And so therefore being sat in clinic having this conversation about all of these really scary things that can happen, if you then have to go home to a flat where you don't know people that well and your parents are 2-3 hours away from you, that can be very scary. And I think it's just those sort of little things that don't honestly cross a lot of people's minds. For me, I feel like I was quite lucky in that, I kept my hospital team at home. So I did still have my parents to go back to. But I know, like, for other people who have been diagnosed at university, like I was, their hospital teams have been, yeah, hours away from their parents. And it can just be quite daunting and quite scary to then not have people to go back to and talk to about it, I guess.
Brilliant. Is there any other comments in the chat, Heather or Amelia, that you'd like to pick up, and I guess this is sort of last chance for any HCPs in the call to maybe just stick in any little questions quickly before we move on.
I think possibly one that someone said about menstrual cycles. Yes, it is definitely something I feel is not talked about enough. I found that when I go into clinic and ask questions about how to deal with that, they basically go, "Oh, you're doing well enough." And for me, that isn't what I want to hear. I've always been the type of gold star diabetic where I'm like, I can always do better. And to go in and basically just be told it's fine what you're doing, that's not useful. If you have a patient who is actively saying, I want to do better, that should be something where immediately we go, okay, how can we support you? What can we do to make you feel like you are actively achieving and, you know, doing the best thing you can for your diabetes? Personally, I've just kind of figured it out as I've gone along. I've just done the best I can and a lot of trial and error because I haven't really had any healthcare support on that side of things, and it's just literally been me and my mum sit down and go, okay, what, look for the patterns and try and find out what happens. And obviously, it's not going to be the same every month. It's never the same, because diabetes is just fun like that. It just likes to throw you a loop, but yeah, I think that's definitely something that I would be very interested in what your um what your opinions are of that, of how you cope with that, because obviously it's female only, and obviously you're not going to sit if you've got a group session with. I had a Sarah Connect group session and I had 5 guys with me, and I was not going to sit there and be really open about it because I went to school with some of them. I think that's an interesting topic that could definitely be approached in a different way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was also just reading the comment that kind of agreeing with actually what me and Heather both said, to do with it being quite tough from 18 with the level of support, and the fact that a lot of the kind of emotions are deemed as normal, but it is really important to be able to voice the anger, frustration, and sadness. Yeah, I completely agree with. And I think actually, kind of going back obviously to the topic of complications, when those topics are brought up, there kind of does need to be the space in appointments to voice the fear that comes with that, and to not have to feel like you just have to sit there, take it all, and be like, okay, cool, that's fine, I'll just move on with my life now. And to actually be able to sit there and say, okay, that's a lot of information for me, that's really scary. Like, what what is the likelihood of some of these things? Like, how bad would it be? What could be done to help me if these things did happen? Because, yeah, I know for me, I'm someone who needs a lot of reassurance with those kind of things. I need to know what the likelihood is, honestly. And I need to know what would be done to help me, like physically and emotionally. So, yeah, I think having that space to voice those feelings is so important.
I agree. I think that as soon as I was under psychological support, I was kind of sidelined to be like, you have someone to deal with that now. We don't need to talk to you about that. And I feel like that kind of happens sometimes in adult clinics where it's like, you obviously time constraints and budgets and all the things we know about, like you have the checklist of, okay, I've got to talk to this patient about this, and get that ticked off. And obviously then by the end of it, you're like out of time of, okay, I've got to get my next patient in. And I think that's possibly something that is where, something like an online session or a group session where you could go into more detail, and obviously age appropriate as well, but you can go into more detail of going, okay, so for talking about pregnancy and miscarriage, you could have a group that is just young females between the ages of 16 and 18 or 15 and 18, sit them down and go, okay, this is what applies to you. And you can almost be a little bit more specific about what you talk about. And I think then that also helps gain that trust that someone was speaking about, of trying to, be more, as soon as you start being more specific, that's when the trust can come in, because you feel like you can open up more, because this is someone that's taken the time to try and help you and try and support your needs as best as possible.
I think in a way it's sort of almost bridging that gap then between kind of what we do like within Gather Type 1 and kind of the conversations we're all having, kind of supporting each other through peer support and giving ourselves space to discuss those things, but actually in a clinical setting so that you can ask the questions and you can be provided with that kind of proper medical information. So yeah, like Heather was saying, having those kind of more specific groups so that it's not eating into your actual clinic time, but it is in that kind of controlled setting.
Yeah, I think someone's just said you learn so much from each other. Me and Amelia could literally sit here all night and essentially just have a conversation bouncing off each other, thinking of things we have done before. That's definitely something that can literally just facilitating a group meeting of letting your patients feel those feelings and saying it is completely okay to feel like that. I think that can definitely be of so much use as well.
Brilliant. Any final comments then before we move on to the next part? Brilliant. Well, if you do have any more questions to go in the chat as we move on now, then please put them in, and I'm sure Amelia and Heather will be happy to answer them before we finish. But the final bit now really is just about feedback, and I'd really encourage all of you to go on and complete this feedback form if possible before you go, because we try and put these sessions on, and it's really important that we make them as relevant to yourselves as healthcare professionals as possible. It's the way that we can put on the best sessions possible, really. So any kind of advice, any thoughts, feelings, any ways that you think we can improve, anything that you did enjoy about the session, then please let us know. But yeah, in the meantime, while you sort of look to complete the feedback form, we'll remain in the call if you do have any questions for Amelia or Heather or even myself and Lily as in terms of the Together Type 1 program.